So there are two types of seed plants, gymnosperms and angiosperms. We're going to look at gymnosperms first. So that word actually means naked seed. Gymno means naked and sperm refers to the seed. Okay, so we mentioned a couple of slides back that some of these seed plants have their seeds completely covered and some don't. So when we look at a cone, which is very characteristic of the gymnosperms, they have these kind of woody scales that make up the cone, and when the cone opens up, you can see on every scale that there is a couple of seeds. And so when the cone opens up, that seed is exposed to the environment, and so that's why we call it a naked seed. It's not totally covered and protected. So group or kinds of plants that are in this group, cycads and ginkgos, we're just going to show you pictures, but we're not going to do a lot of detail, and then we'll spend a little bit more time on the conifers, which are the cone-bearing plants, and those would be ones that you're probably a little bit more familiar with. So cycads, maybe this looks a little bit like a fern to you, but if you were to touch the leaves of this cycad plant, you would see that they're very sharp and needle-like and pointy, so they're not soft like ferns. And they do produce cones. The cones are a little bit different looking. You can have a female plant or a male plant, and the cones look just a little bit different. You would find these are somewhat tropical. You might see these along the highway driving down to Galveston, starting around Houston. You see them a lot on the Gulf Coast. So that is an example of a gymnosperm that we're not going to spend time on, but just so you can see what they look like. The pictures from your book show when you have the mature female cone of a cycad, you can see that it kind of starts to blow up and expose all the seeds, and then the seeds can drop out. And if these are growing by the coast, a lot of times those seeds end up in the ocean, and then they're going to float to some other part of the coast or maybe to an island, and then they will germinate and grow a new cycad wherever they end up. So female cones in the end basically explode open and release all their seeds to the environment. Okay, the other gymnosperm that we're just going to mention is the ginkgo, and maybe you've heard of ginkgo because it's sold as a health supplement, but what I want you to remember about it is that it's a living fossil. So that means that we have fossilized remains of ginkgos that are millions of years old, but if you look at the modern ginkgo, the leaves are pretty much exactly the same. So it's a fossil, but it's in modern times still pretty much the same as it was many, many years ago. So we'll have you look at a ginkgo tree when you go to the garden. And then these are called cones. They probably don't look much like a cone to you, but you have a male and a female ginkgo tree also. So this one here at the top is the female, and that's where the seed would be and all of that kind of thing. They're a little bit smelly. They smell a little bit like sour or rancid butter. So people use ginkgos in their landscape because they're ornamental type trees, but normally they will get the male tree, which this is what the male cones look like, and they don't smell so bad. And the supplement, I can't remember if I mentioned to you, but the supplement, if you buy it, is usually marketed for memory. So it's not FDA approved for that, but that's what people use it for. So here's another picture so you can see in the fall it changes colors. It's a nice looking tree. So we're going to spend most of our time looking at the conifers, so the ones that produce the cones that you would recognize. And we do have both male and female types, so this more woody type cone is the female, and this a little bit softer, fleshier cone is the male cone. So the female cone would be producing the eggs, and the male cone would be producing the pollen that produces produces sperm, okay? And so when we look at the leaves of a conifer, they are needle-like, just like the cycad, okay? So they're thin, they're coated. It helps these plants to keep from losing as much water through their leaves, especially because a lot of them live in colder climates, in climates where it's cold and dry for part of the year, and they don't want to lose so much water. So they don't usually lose their leaves in the winter time, but they have leaves that are very resistant to water loss. And they also produce resin. So if you go and buy a real Christmas tree, a pine tree at Christmas time, and have the people cut off a little bit of the trunk before you bring it home, you know that it smells good and it's kind of sticky. That's the resins that are produced by these trees. And so again, this would be wood that would be good for building because they're producing chemicals that help to keep it from being attacked by insects or fungus, and so it doesn't decay as quickly. On this slide, I'm just giving you, I put a couple of videos that I would like you to take a look at down here. We're not going to watch them together, but two kind of important conifers in this group, the redwood, which we have here on the left, and this is an old picture. I believe this tree has since fallen down, but you can see how huge it is that you can actually drive a car under it. So in the living classification of living organisms, the redwood is the largest. Let's see if I can get this pen to write here. The largest living organism. Okay, it's very, very, very tall, over 300 feet tall, and I forget how many tons, but very heavy. The bristlecone pine is the oldest living organism. And so in this one group, you have some kind of record holders in terms of largest organisms and oldest organisms. So we've looked at this diagram at the beginning, but just kind of as a follow-up here. So we think that the green algae were ancestors to the land plants, and the first group of land plants were the mosses, which are small and low-lying and dependent on water. They don't have vascular tissue. And then we go through changes, and ferns develop, which have vascular tissue, but they still have sperm that needs to be able to have some water to swim to the egg. And then as we get a little bit higher, we have plants that have seeds and have pollen. These are the gymnosperms. So now they're not dependent on water for fertilization, but of course they need water to do photosynthesis. So the top level of plants is the angiosperms, also seed plants. Angio means vessel or protected. So these are the plants that their seed actually is completely covered. And these are the plants that make flowers. So that's the top level of plants, okay? They're all over this planet, from the coldest to the warmest regions. They can be really small, they can be pretty large, so there's huge diversity in this group of plants. So we're going to look at the flower, because this is the only type of group of plant that has a flower. And not all flowers look exactly the same, but most of them have some of these basic structures, okay? So I'm going to mention the sepals first. So you can see down here at the bottom, the sepal is kind of the outer layer of the flower. And when the flower is not open, the sepals are going to cover over the petals. And so you have, when you have a rosebud or something, the green on the outside is the sepals. And that's protective for the plant or the flower. And when you look at all of those sepals together, that layer would be called the calyx. When you come into the next layer, so that would be this layer here, we have petals. That whole layer together we call the corolla, which means crown. And most of the time flowers are pretty brightly colored, and that helps to attract insects and birds and whoever's going to be pollinating the flower. Okay, the next level in, or the next layer in, are the stamens, which are the male part for the plant. And it has basically the two parts. It has the filament, which holds it up, and then it has the anther. And the anther is the part that produces the pollen, which the pollen then will produce sperm. So this picture is from a different book, but I like it because it's big and it's well labeled. So just as kind of a refresher or reminder, sepals are on the outer layer. We come into the next layer, which is the petals, which we can also call the corolla altogether. And then the next layer in are the stamens, which are the male part, made of a filament and an anther, and the anther produces the pollen. Okay? So your book has some pictures of different kinds of flowers, and the point here being that not all flowers look the same. So this is what a banana flower looks like, and maybe that's not like a common flower to you. This is ohia, which is the state flower of Hawaii. This is passion flower here, and these do grow in Texas. And then these are cattails. Cattails are grasses, but they have a very interesting flower. It doesn't maybe look like the flower that you might normally visualize in your mind when you think of what a flower is. Okay, so we've looked at the outer parts of the flower. So we're going to look in the very center, which is the carpel. Okay. I'm going to just put another term out here because some books will use the term pistil to describe the female part of the flower. So just in some of the videos I think that I linked for you, they do use that term, so I want you to know what they're talking about. So it's in the very center of the flower, okay? And down at the bottom we have the ovary, and this is where the ovules are, and this is where then you would produce the eggs, okay? The style basically elevates the top part, so it kind of looks like a vase, and then the top part of the carpel is the stigma, and this is where the pollen would land, okay? So when fertilization is going to happen, pollen is going to land here. We're going to develop a pollen tube, which is going to take the sperm down to the egg. So within the ovary, a lot of flowers will produce nectar, and that's important for also for attracting pollinators. And so if they're attracted because of the nectar and they crawl around in the bottom of that flower, they're probably going to pick up pollen also. So this is kind of a nice video just to kind of review parts of flowers for you. So you can watch that when you re-look at this PowerPoint. Okay? So I kind of have already talked about this part, but I didn't talk about the spore part. Remember, this is the sporophyte, okay? So within the anther, you have these microspores, meaning they're pretty small. They divide. That's what produces the pollen, okay? Pollen released from the anther, and then it may be picked up by the female part of the plant. And so in the female part, you also have spores, which are going to undergo mitosis to produce the egg. So megaspores and microspores just kind of illustrate difference in size. That is not going to be a test question, okay? But we do find that in the flowering plants. So again, I'm really not going to put flowering or any kind of plant life cycle pictures on a test, but I think that looking at the life cycle, you can recognize some of the things that we have talked about. So this is looking at a flowering plant, and you can see here's the flower, okay? And within the flower, you have the male parts and the female parts. So you have the parts that produce pollen, and you have the parts that produce the egg, and then the pollen basically is going to land on the stigma, develop a pollen tube, which the sperm can then swim down and fertilize the egg, and then you end up with a seed. And you may have an ovary that has a bunch of seeds in it, And when you plant those seeds, you're going to grow the next generation of the plant. So this is very short. It's just maybe less than a minute, but it gives you a good view for how a flower opens up, and you can see all those parts of the flower.